anybody else joins in, they can pick right up. So again, for those that just logged in, we're going to talk about the listing agreement since we finally made it through the purchase agreement. And so if you would like to have one in front of you, because I'm working from home today, I don't have the ability to pull dot loop up and show the screen while I'm doing the class. So if you want to put a listing agreement in front of you, you can grab one and we will go through it. And then just stop me along the way if you have questions. Janet, good morning. Bob, good morning. Okay, so for those that have been in my listing class before, I say this all the time, so I'm going to repeat it because I truly, truly, truly believe it is true. We can solve a lot of the problems that we see when a property goes pending if we cover a few additional things more thoroughly on our listing appointments and on the listing side. So we'll talk about that as we're going through it. So we're just going to pick right up here. And if you've got one, we'll just start at page 1 and we'll just go through it for the next hour. And if we don't get all the way through it, we'll pick back up. And if you guys have questions along the way or something that you are not sure about on the listing agreement, just stop me or type in the chat box. I got that pulled up here. So obviously, you know, on the first page, we're filling out, you know, for our company, you know, it's Century 21 Bradley, you're as the agent. And it's very important to put the correct seller's information in there. You know, sometimes we have married people, but maybe they bought the home and it was just in the husband's name and then he got married, you know, since then. So, you know, you can pull up that information, the tax records and things like that to find all that stuff out. So hopefully before you know, when you get a call to go out and list a house, you know, the first thing you should do obviously is go on to MLS and pull up a history on it, see, you know, when it was listed last, if ever, what it listed and sold for, maybe how long it was on the market, those types of things. And then obviously pull up the tax record, not only to see what the new assessment is. We know assessments aren't going to be totally accurate, but to get a kind of an idea. And that will also give you the exact legal description that you're going to want to put in there. So those things are pretty important to pull up. So from there, when we talk about the contract begins on a certain date and expires at a certain date, obviously that's the terms of your contract. I just saw again the other day, people are still kind of questioning the timeframes for MLS. So I will hopefully clarify that here for you. So we still have the 72 hours to get a listing in MLS once you get the listing. So you have your 72 hours is still the time frame that MLS goes off of, unless you start marketing it. So if you mention it on social media, if you, you know, put an ad out there anywhere, or if you put a sign in the yard, a sign is considered marketing. So once the sign goes in the yard, then you have 1 business day. And again, I want to clarify that it says business day. So technically, if you list a house on Saturday, or, you know, late Friday night, whatever, you have until Monday morning to get it into MLS because it's 1 business day. So a lot of people are kind of taking advantage of that loophole as well. But if you don't mark it, you don't stick the sign in the yard, whatever, then it is 72 hours. So does anybody have any questions on that?
I do, Vicky.
Yes, ma'am.
So when I keep seeing everybody it's like 0 days on the market and then 0 days on the market. But when you know that they have signs in the yard already, don't they have to go back and put that original date on there? Or can they mark it before they actually have the listing contract done? Because then it's going to show 1 day on the market, 2 days on the market or whatever. And I keep seeing that.
Yeah, unfortunately with this hot market that we're in, you have a lot of people that are pushing the envelope. No, I mean, you are not supposed to, you know, once the sign goes up, it doesn't matter, you know, whatever. Once that sign hits the yard, it's
okay.
But I know what you're saying. There is a lot of people that do you see a lot of 0 days on the market. Keep in mind, I think a lot of those we've all been a part, especially in this market, with facilitating for sale by owners.
Right.
Where a seller and a buyer already met and talked, and they just want somebody to write up the contract and process it for them. And, we charge whatever we, feel want on that. So I do think some of those 0 days on the market are a lot of these for sale by owners that we're facilitating, but we want them in the computer for comps.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I think that that's part of it.
Okay.
Okay. And so obviously, if you do get a for sale by owner, I encourage you to get it into MLS, and MLS realizes that this is happening. And, so if you have any trouble with it, you can always reach out to Joe there at MLS, and he can, tell you exactly how to do it. Or one of our, Heather at the office, one of the gals at the office can help you with that. But basically, I've also had some people, to come to protect yourself in case, let's say you're putting a for sale by owner together. And, as with any of our transactions, once it gets to inspection stage, it might fall apart. So I encourage you to, if somebody asks you, if a seller says, hey, I found a buyer for my house and I just need somebody to write it up, do what I would consider a one-party listing contract. So basically, you're going to fill out a listing contract. So that talks about what he's going to pay you. Gives you the chance to kind of go over some stuff with him. And if that deal falls apart, hopefully then you can revert that into removing that one party and actually listing it. So in the other terms and provisions, and we'll get to that when we get through the listing documents here, you could put in the other terms and provisions that this listing is for this particular buyer, and that you're facilitating, a seller has already found a buyer. They've asked you to facilitate the transaction. They are okay with it going into MLS for a comp, and so that this is a listing agreement. It's a one-party listing agreement for that particular buyer.
Okay.
Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, Vicky, can you hear me?
Thanks, Vicky.
You're welcome.
Can you hear me, Vicky?
I can.
Okay. This is Shannon.
Yeah.
So I've been working with some people. I'm working with the buyer, and they keep finding FSBOs. And I was just signing like the FSBO commission agreement.
Sure, you can do that.
Okay.
Well, especially because in your case, you're not actually at this point in time, you're representing a buyer. You're showing them what you're trying to do is show them listed and unlisted, correct?
Correct.
So what, that's totally acceptable. You're going to want to fill out the office policy for buyers with them.
Yeah.
Because that covers how we work as agents. And, what if you list a house that's perfect for them? Are they okay with you? You need to go through that process with them to let them know what limited agency is and that type of thing. But at that point in time, you're technically representing the buyer, not the seller.
Correct.
So yes, you could just do the FSBO agreement on that.
Okay.
So I'm talking about, if a seller comes up to you and says, hey, you know what, in fact,
I found a buyer.
Yeah, I've got a buyer for my home. They're offering me the price and maybe they want you to even run comps to make sure that what the buyer offered them is a fair price.
Mm-hmm.
Or got some work involved in whatever. So at that point in time, you could actually turn it into a one-party listing. You don't have to. I'm just saying that's one way to do it. You could still facilitate the for sale by owner using the for sale by owner agreement. And, if and when that transaction kind of, maybe if it does go by the wayside, that's when you want to start having a conversation with the seller that, you'd love to list it and find another buyer for it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Yep.
Ways we
Hey,
can do it.
Vicky,
Yes.
what is the going rate now for a for sale by owner, or is each case an individual one?
Mm-hmm.
Say that again, Pam. I'm sorry, you cut out on my phone.
Oh, nowadays, what is the average commission price or cost that they're going to pay you, or is each one different?
As always, commissions are negotiable. It's whatever you agree to work out. Some people obviously, kind of depends on the amount of work you're doing on it. As I say, sometimes people are literally just, I already have everything negotiated. All I want you to do is write it up, whatever. And, so maybe you're, and I find it, if you maybe go into that agreement and say, okay, if you just want me to write it up, I can charge you this. Sometimes it's 1%, sometimes it's a flat fee. If you would like to, what I'd like to do is help you through this entire process and let me be involved with your inspection process and, get this to the closing table. And, I'm representing you, Mr. Seller, in this transaction. And, rather than paying 6 or 7% commission, I'm willing to do it for, 3 or whatever. That is a negotiable thing. You have the right to get that based on the amount. And like I said, don't sell yourself short, because sometimes these for sale by owners cause you just as much headaches as other transactions. So, be compensated fairly for it. And I always tell clients, let them know that if you are writing up this form, you basically, you are a licensed real estate agent in the state of Indiana. And we also have things like E&O insurance and things like that. And once your name goes on this paperwork, you're part of this transaction. So you need to cover yourself.
I didn't know also if you have to talk to a manager or something before you can tell somebody what you would charge.
No, I mean, I have told people before, if you're trying to negotiate a commission and let's say, you're struggling with, let's say you're going on a normal listing appointment and you're struggling with getting, the seller to, be reasonable about a commission, what you can say, and I have no problem with saying this, is, hey, our company Century 21 Bradley charges 7% commission. And here's why. Here's the services that we offer that warrant that price. And we do things that no other company will do for you. And we're open more hours than any other company is open for your benefit of making sure that these showings happen and things like that. So that's a whole different spiel. We can talk about that when we talk about the listing appointment. And but what I have told people before is throw us under the bus and just say, look, Century 21 Bradley charges 7. I am willing and I am allowed to, go down to 6, whatever you want to say, 6.5, 5, 5.5, whatever. Below that, I would have to get permission from my management. You don't have to, but you could throw us under the bus and say, I really need to talk to my company to see if this is feasible.
Okay.
You know what I mean? You can, I'm here to help you guys in that regards. And hopefully they see the services that you provide warrant, the commission and we'll talk about that when we talk about going out on a listing appointment. But, typically sellers that go through a real estate agent pay commission still net more than they would without paying a realtor and trying to sell it on their own. And those are NAR stats, and I'll try and get those stats and get them out. But, you don't have to, PM, but you could certainly, use that if you'd like to on your appointment to say, you know what, I'm not comfortable going below 6%. I really feel like I need to run this past my manager.
Yes, that's a good answer. Yeah, the other company I worked for, you had to go through management before you could do anything like that.
I don't have a problem with that. You could say I'm not I'm not comfortable and I really feel like this is something I need to run past my company and my manager and see what we can do here. What some people do when they're talking about commission is also say, you know what, let's list it at this. And if I bring a buyer to the table myself, therefore I'm on both sides and I have total, that way I feel like I have control of this transaction, how we work through the inspection responses, how, we deal with the title company and things like that. Now I'm willing to, come down a little bit further. And I've had people actually put that on the listing agreement and say, look, I'm going to list this for 7%. If I bring a buyer to the table, I will drop it down to 5.5 or whatever you're comfortable with.
Right.
You're on both sides of it.
Right.
And the other thing to tell the seller is commission isn't paid or owed until you do your job and sell the house. So at the end of the day, if they're not happy with the sale price, they don't have to accept the offer and they're not going to owe you anything.
Right. That's
Good point.
correct. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions on any of that? We kind of jumped the gun there. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat. So once you fill out the dates, the contract begins and expires. If I were you, on your expiration date, obviously, listings are flying off the shelf. So it's kind of a moot point these days to list it for a year because it's going to sell within days, right? But if I were you, especially as the market may change and things aren't moving quite as quickly, if you use some sort of calendar app or whatever, I don't know, or in your CRM, make sure that you put that expiration date and a reminder for you to reach out to the client prior to that expiration date to get an extension. You don't want to call them up the day it's expiring, panicking, saying, oh, I just thought of you and it's going to expire. I don't want this to fall out of the computer. Obviously, you should be in communications with your clients anyways, but you're really not going to talk about extending it until you kind of get close to that expiration date. So I always recommend throwing that into either your CRM, drip camp, reminder, your calendar reminders, whatever platform you guys use, to remind yourself when that's about a week away from expiring, so you can start working on that. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Obviously, list price, that's going to be filled in by you. And that next phrase on there is pretty important because it says seller represents that the seller is or is not delinquent on any loans. Well, they're telling you up front that they're not behind in their home payments and things like that, because we all know, obviously, if they haven't made their payment for months and they could be in pre-foreclosure state and they're not telling you that. They're trying to keep things from you, and you're going to find it out, down the road, and that's not the time to find it out. So that's covered on the listing. And sometimes they're embarrassed about that, but I think we added this to the listing agreement because of that. It used to not be on there. So a lot of times you'd list a home and, many times sellers would think, well, they're not, if I hurry up and get this sold, they're never going to find out I didn't make, I haven't made my house payments for 6 months. And they think they're not going to find that out. And so now it's here, and they're saying that they're not behind in their home payments, because if they are, then that's something you need to say, well, we need to find out from your lender where you're at here. Have they started proceedings or whatever? So that's important.
I thought they couldn't do any proceedings right now for foreclosures or anything.
Right now, but we're at a really, yes, I do believe that is part of it, but it's still something we need to know, obviously, right?
Right. It was just a thought.
Right, sure. So that part's pretty important on all of that. So, like I said, that's kind of embarrassing for them, but at the end of the day, I think that our forms committee added this on there because it was an important conversation to have with the seller, and we need to know it when we list the property, not after we've got an offer to purchase and we're getting close to close to find out, oh, well, the bank started foreclosure proceedings. Obviously, seller is or is not a foreign person. We're not tax people. We just need to know that, because we need to tell them if they are a foreign person, a foreign entity, that then they probably need to talk to their tax advisor on, how that's going to play out for them. We're not tax people. We just need to let them know that that's something they need to look into, because they will be subject to foreign sales tax. Okay, so terms of the sale, obviously, we'll take cash. I mean, I think any seller's going to take cash, right? I think most of the time all this is pretty good, but sometimes we get into these properties where it probably isn't going to go FHA, and so don't push FHA if you don't think it's going to go FHA. So that's something to think about when you're listing it. I'm seeing a few more land sales contracts happening. I see a lot of people asking questions about that on Facebook. So do you guys see more land contracts going on right now than before?
I haven't.
Yeah, it seems like I've had a lot of people asking questions about it. So, I mean, obviously that's, most sellers, that's not ideal for most sellers. They want to sell it so they can get their cash out so they can move forward and buy a home or build or whatever they're doing. I was just curious because I've seen several questions about that on Facebook. The next line there, seller agrees to pay costs associated with financing not to exceed whatever. This is where you want to say to the seller, look, in a lot of markets that we're in, the buyer may ask the seller to pay, especially the types of financing, maybe price ranges that you're in, but it's not uncommon for a buyer to ask the seller to pay some closing costs. And so have that conversation with them. Now, you don't have to decide on an amount now. I think it's time to have that conversation that I'm just letting you know, Mr. Seller, we may get an offer where a buyer asks this. And the funny thing is, we had that actually happen. It was an older, elderly, seller who was floored that a buyer would ask him to pay. He's like, why should I pay a buyer? I'm selling my house. Why should I pay money for the buyer to buy my house? And so it's just the time to have that conversation. Many people haven't bought or sold real estate in many, many, many years, and things have changed a lot since then. So just time to have that conversation. And, that obviously if a buyer asks that, they may overcompensate on the sale price to cover that, and explain to them why some buyers ask that. It's just a great conversation to have with the seller at the time of listing, so it doesn't surprise them down the road when they go to get the offer and you're going through it with them. So you don't really have to come up with an amount. To me, that's just the time to have that conversation, explain to a seller why that might happen. Let's see here. So then the next line is where I say it's very important, and this could save a lot of headaches when you get the offer to purchase. Got a lot of people that have been in my classes before, so Tim and Jane and all you guys know that we talk about this in every time I've covered the listing. When you list a home, what you need to do is go room by room with the seller and say, we need to take a look at everything. I need to see what is actually attached or built in or fixed and what isn't. And we need to talk about what you want to stay and what you don't want to leave, because so many of these arbitration cases have to do with that. A seller took something that was affixed and the buyer was like, well, he took that out. He wasn't supposed to. And the seller's like, no, I told the agent I was taking that. So this is the time when you list the house to be very careful and go room by room, stop, take a look at the room. We do wall mount TVs these days. So obviously that has changed a lot. And if there's a wall mount TV, the TV is not going to remain with the home because that just slides on the bracket. But those brackets that are screwed into the wall are now affixed to the wall. So those stay. And if a seller wants to take them, he either needs to exclude them, or personally, I recommend you go ahead and take them off now, patch the holes, put his TV on a stand or whatever, and then there's no questions about it. And then a buyer isn't asking the seller to fix the holes, with the offer to purchase and paint and all that kind of stuff. So, and anymore, we have more than one TV and usually more than one TV mounted. So we're not just talking about the living room TV. Then you go in the master bedroom and maybe there's a wall mount TV. So same thing, Mr. Seller, just so you know, you're going to be able to take your TV with you, but those brackets have to stay on the wall. So you have a choice to either exclude them. And then a buyer is probably going to ask you to fill the holes and paint, or just do that now so there's no questions about what's going to stay. So that's one thing. Curtain rods, obviously, if the curtain rods themselves are, screwed into the wall, the rods are going to stay. Now the draperies hanging on the curtain rods do not stay. But the brackets and the actual hardware does. And believe it or not, we had one of our toughest arbitration cases over silly curtain rods that were probably $10 curtain rods from Walmart. I mean, they were nothing, they were all different. And a buyer went ballistic because the seller took them out. And then the seller said, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have taken them. I'll bring them back. And they said, well, how do we know then that you didn't strip the screws so they won't screw into the wall now? We don't want them. We want money. So, quickly $10 curtain rods became a very expensive arbitration case. And as silly as it sounds, it was ugly. It was really ugly. And, so those are the times to have that conversation with the seller, remind him, if you got curtain rods screwed into the wall, those stay. And if you want to take them, let's take them down now rather than exclude them. Let's patch the holes, paint, and then there's just no question that it's not going to be a problem. So things like that become problems. Has anybody else had any other situations where you have or haven't excluded something and it's turned into a big dispute? Because I know I've seen a ton of arbitration cases over it. Nope, nobody? Okay, we have one agent that's not on here, and this was a new one for me. It was rural property and had a huge pond. And in the pond, there was one of those water features, a fountain. So, you know, obviously the sellers like to sit on the deck and the beautiful fountain spraying over the pond. And when the buyers looked at the home, they had the pond turned on and the water fountain was flowing and everything. When the sellers moved out, they unplugged that and took it with them. And the buyer's like, where's my water feature? So that was kind of an interesting one, because is it really affixed? It's kind of sunk down in the bottom of the water, but just crazy things come up, guys. It's just so funny, the things that actually people argue over. We used to have big fights over those big Gorilla basketball goals, because the pole itself was affixed to the ground, but the actual hoop and the backboard just slides on top of those poles. So again, we had a huge arbitration case because the seller obviously left the pole because that's cemented to the ground, but they pulled off the Gorilla basketball goal and took it with them. And those were very expensive. So things to talk about, note when you're walking around the property, very important. And then talk about what you want to stay. So this is when you want to get into, you know, appliances, especially. Mr. Seller, you're planning on leaving the stainless steel appliances. And then, you know, you're going to list those obviously in the listing agreement. And we'll talk about with that on the purchase agreement in just a minute, but you're going to go through that with the seller. And, you know, in this day and age, a lot of times it's more than just the kitchen appliances. A lot of times now you have the extra refrigerator in the basement, or maybe in the garage or in the mechanical room, or maybe there's another freezer somewhere. And then we've got the washers and dryers. So have that conversation with the seller. What does he plan on leaving? What is he taking with him? What's negotiable? That kind of thing. And then let the seller know too, that once a buyer buys the house and they ask for the appliances to remain, this seems silly, but Mr. Seller, you have to leave the same appliances that are in the house when the buyer looked at it. You can't swap those out, because yep, that's happened. So make sure that you cover that with the seller as well. And kind of a side note to that, we talked about this when we went through the purchase agreement. So even though you list the appliances, the purchase agreement is going to trump the listing. So technically, and this is where I say again, it's better to find these things out up front rather than have to deal with arbitration later. So technically, let's say you list the home, all appliances remain, including the washer and dryer. Okay, buyer comes along, writes an offer, and doesn't ask for them. So technically the seller now doesn't have to leave them, because the purchase agreement is going to trump the listing, because the seller's offering them, but the buyer didn't ask for them. So when you get that offer to purchase, in my opinion, pick up the phone and ask the listing agent, hey, I'm just double checking here. We had in the listing the appliances we're going to stay with the sale. You didn't ask for them. You know, is that because your people really don't want them, or did you just forget to put them in there? And the reason I say this is because, you know, many times the agent is in a hurry to write the offer and they don't put it in there. And then you get a buyer's moving in and they do their final walkthrough. Refrigerator's gone, washer and dryer's gone, because they didn't ask for it. And then the buyer is looking at the agent going, where's my appliances? The listing said they stayed. And here we are at arbitration again. So technically and legally, the purchase agreement is going to trump, you know, the list, what's in the listing. If they didn't ask for them, you know, the seller would probably assume they don't want them. But in my opinion, after doing this for as long as I've done it, pick up the phone and have that conversation with the agent that wrote the offer and just say, hey, does your client, you didn't write the appliances in, even though we offered them, where are you at on that? Because, you know, my seller got, you know, a neighbor that wants to buy them or whatever. So find that out before you get into that arbitration state. It just is much easier. This is where I say the listing, having these conversations with the seller is going to save a lot of headaches down the road when you're working with the buyer. Has anybody had that happen?
Yes,
What happened, Pam?
I sold a house and on the listing, it said they would put a refrigerator in. It didn't have one. And on the, when we got the offer, they didn't ask for a refrigerator.
Right,
So we didn't put one in.
right.
And they came back and said, hey, you put on the disclosure and the listing that you were going to do a refrigerator. And I said, but you didn't ask for it.
Did that go to arbitration?
No, but my manager requested that I put a refrigerator in.
And, I don't know how many years ago that was, Pam, and I know offers purchase and, verbiages change. And the reason I say I would clarify this, because technically, in my opinion, and legally, I've talked to, different people about this, but the purchase agreement is always going to trump the listing.
Right.
But once you go to arbitration, you're at the arbitrator's mercy in knowing if they understand that. You know what I'm saying? If it goes to arbitration, it could be an arbitrator that maybe they were stiffed once before in buying a house. Now they have a grudge. And so, they don't want to, they don't want to view it that way.
No.
So legally, that would be my fight at arbitration is purchase agreement is always going to trump anything. This is the final. It does not, you didn't ask for it.
Right.
So, but at the end of the day, once it goes to arbitration, you're at the arbitrator's mercy as to whether they understand that or not. So it's so much easier to clarify this. If you have a listing and the seller is offered to leave stuff and the buyer doesn't write it in, just pick up the phone and have the conversation. Communication solves half the problems that we deal with in this business, right? So
Right.
take on it. If I'm working for a seller and a buyer writes an offer and they don't include it, I'm going to pick up the phone first and say, Mr. Buyer's agent, did you forget to leave this off? I don't want to get to final move-in day and my seller has already sold the washer and dryer to, in a garage sale, and now your buyers want it. So let's talk about it now.
Right.
Because I check and I don't want my seller to write a check. So please, 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 be proactive on that and communicate that.
Okay.
Okay, let's see here. So, and it's just as important to say, and the other thing I was going to say on that, just a couple final notes. Let's say because this actually happened too, maybe there's a beautiful chandelier in the foyer and the seller is like, that's a Swarovski crystal chandelier and I'm going to take that with me. My comment to them is then, okay, go to the lighting store, go to Lowe's, go to Home Depot, go to Menards, I don't care, go to Wabash Electric, wherever, pick out a light, get it installed and take this one down and box it up. If you're moving, you're going to take it with you anyway. Let's get it down now so you don't have a buyer fall in love with it and fight over a light. Because that actually has happened where you have buyers be like, no, that's the light I want. And the seller's like, no, I'm excluding that. So then you get into a fight on a purchase agreement over a light fixture. So if you have something like that and the seller wants to take it, I would recommend you tell the seller to swap it out now. So that there's no question about that. And then again, and just remind them that the appliances that are in the home when the buyer looks at it are the appliances they have to leave. We also had a buyer do a final walkthrough once, and it was all stainless steel appliances in the kitchen. When we looked at the home and when we did the final walkthrough, there was a white dishwasher installed. So what the seller did was he took out his brand new Bosch high-end dishwasher and loaded it on his truck and replaced it with his old white one that he had already taken out before he listed the home. So that was a big to-do. So make sure you cover that with the seller as well. And on the side note, what we talked about in the purchase agreement, if you're working with the buyer, make sure you write into the purchase agreement, what appliances. And I would say that the appliances that are in the home on this date, when we write in the offer, those are the appliances we want to remain with the home. Okay, enough on stuff. Let's see here. Okay, so then this is another section that a lot of people don't cover with their seller. And I think a lot of times this falls into the category when we're dealing with maybe farm property and there's a barn with a lot of, for lack of a better word, crap in it. So basically on the listing agreement here, it covers that seller shall remove all debris and personal property that's not included in the sale. Any existing improvements and fixtures permanently installed and affixed, which seller does not want included in the sale, shall be removed by the seller prior to the effective date of this listing. So we just talked about that. If you want the pretty chandelier out of the foyer, take it out now, get rid of it, hang up a light that the buyers will like, and you won't have a fight over that. And replace with an appropriate substitute if applicable. So that covers that on the listing. But again, I think when we sit down and we go over the listing with our sellers, it's an area that we don't discuss in depth, and that's why we get into arbitration problems down the road. Okay, so obviously we do exclusive listings, and that's what this is. And, you know, we're working for the seller and kind of covers all this kind of good stuff. So I'm not going to read verbatim on that, but covers you on your commission and things like that. The section there at the bottom, you know, when we've had to fight a seller for commission as a company, we've never charged interest rate on that. So I always put 0 on that. I mean, if they owe me a commission, I just want them to pay me my commission. I'm not going to charge them interest on it. Some of you might think differently. We just never have. So I would put 0 in there. Let's see here. Again, then the rest of that just talks about with broker's commission and how that's paid or how that's owed. And so moving on to page 2, if you're following along here, this is where we put our commission in. So we talked about that. It's negotiable. Now, our listing agreements are pre-filled in with 7% because Century 21 Bradley, Jim Bradley, has decided that his company, his fee is 7%. We're worth that. We do enough marketing and things like that. And you know, all of the things that we talked about, and we can, again, I know we have some newer people on here and we talk about doing the listing presentation and how you cover those things, but that's pre-filled in. But we also give you the right to adjust that if you need to. So we've charged 7. If you go on a listing appointment and you want to charge, you know, 6.5, 6, whatever. I mean, that we're giving you that right to do that. Again, don't cut yourself short, but you know, this is where you're going to change that. And this is also where a lot of people forget. This is where it talks about what amount we're going to offer out as a buyer agent there. We're going to pay a buyer's agent starting on line 78 there, whatever we're going to put in there. So, you know, my recommendation is charge 7%, pay out 3. The listing side is the side that spends all the money on marketing. You have more costs associated, you know, with it. And so I would keep 4 and pay out 3. I still, to this day, I'm shocked at how many real estate agents think that it always has to be split 50-50. Like, I hear that so often that it just blows my mind. I actually had a company call me, a small real estate company, not in our MLS, but wanted me to send them a blanket email that said that, you know, whatever transaction we have with them, that we'll give them 50% of the commission. And I laughed and I said, you're a broker and you're asking me this? I said, number one, do you not understand that the commission is set by the seller with the listing company? So you're asking me to put something in writing that I have no control over, because I am already putting on my listing agreement that I'm charging 7%, Mr. Seller, and I'm going to pay out a buyer broker 3%. And so each contract is individual, and you want me to give you a blanket email that says I'll pay you 50%, you need to go back to real estate school and figure out how to do this properly, because I can't do that. There's no way I could do that. So this is where you're going to put what the compensation is. Now, a lot of people kind of forget that, in all honesty, if that gets adjusted, you know, let's say you listed at 7, you're paying out 3. And let's say, you know, you guys agreed to, you know, maybe something happened along the way, and so you agreed to give the other agent 3.5%, or the other side is going to take 2%. Then really you should do an amendment to the listing that says on this transaction, the BAC is now whatever it is, but because it's on the listing contract. So, you know, basically if you're changing anything on the listing contract, you need to do an amendment to the listing. A lot of people don't follow through with that. And I guess it's implied if it closes and everybody's paid what they're paid, then it's, you know, it's implied. But my feeling is it should be an amendment, proper paperwork, keeps us out of jail. I'm all about staying out of jail. So this is also where we have pre-printed in there our 198 administrative broker commission that's due at the time of closing. So this is the time to have the conversation with the sellers. And excuse me, Century 21 Bradley charges the administrative broker commission, and you know, Mr. Seller, you don't owe that until, again, you know, no different than the commission. If I don't do my job and get this sold for the price that you want, that fee doesn't even come into the conversation, because you don't owe me anything if I haven't done my job and get the home sold and close. So we can give you more information on that, but we've pre-printed that on there so you don't forget to talk about that. So that's in there. Commission attorney fees, that just a line that everybody should read and know what it says. Basically, if it would go to court, the unsuccessful party is supposed to cover the attorney fees for the other side. I don't know that that's ever happened in my years of doing this, but it's on there. Earnest money is something I think that you should discuss with your seller at the time of listing, because most sellers, especially if they haven't bought or sold a home in a very long time, maybe don't really realize what earnest money is, how it comes to be, what happens with it, and that kind of thing. And I think we schmooze over that on the listing side because we worry about it on the purchase agreement. But now's the time to have that conversation with the seller. Obviously, Mr. Seller, I'm working hard to get you the highest possible price in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of inconvenience to you. And when somebody brings me an offer, we're going to go through things, and earnest money is one of the things we're going to talk about. It's kind of where a buyer's going to put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, and they're willing to say, I'll give you X amount of dollars for earnest money, and that'll go towards the purchase of the home. But Mr. Seller, if they don't get financing, or if the property doesn't appraise or things like that, you know, there are situations where that money is going to go straight back to the buyer. But also, Mr. Seller, if we have a buyer that just chooses to walk away, this is one way that I'll fight for you to get compensated. So kind of explain what earnest money is and how it works. Does anybody cover earnest money at time of listing with their clients? I'm just curious, because I think a lot of times we wait and talk about it on the purchase agreement, but does anybody talk about it at the time of listing?
Yes.
I do.
Great.
Not usually.
Tim,
Oh,
you
yes.
first.
Okay. Typically, I want to set the tone for the expectation.
Yep.
I try to do that in all aspects of my business. So I just explain to them what it's for. And if the contract is broken, then that money is at risk for the buyer.
Yep.
So, I mean, I try to lay the ground rules clearly and concisely so I meet the expectation of my client.
Yeah.
I don't try to make it complicated. I work on the KISS method.
Keep it simple.
Yes.
And I'm not going to say stupid, because they're not. Keep it seller.
Yeah, I like that.
We're not going to call our seller stupid right now, right?
Not yet.
Who else said that they cover it at the time of listing? Want to interject anything? I don't remember who else said that.
I did, but yeah, and I tried to go through as much, but you know, I have to read the client too and see, you know, how much information do they really want to know.
Right.
I don't want to confuse them with a whole bunch of stuff either. So I just kind of have to read the client to see whether this is something that might be important to them.
And I appreciate that. And I think that kind of goes in line with, you know, even with Tim, it's like, you just want to mention it, because that way, if and when a deal falls apart and then the seller goes, well, I get the earnest money, right? Then that's when you can say, now, remember, we talked about this at the time of listing, that, you know, they didn't get financing. So technically the purchase agreement was subject to them getting financing. Therefore, they get their earnest money back. So, you know, it's always good when you can say, hey, Mr. Seller, remember we talked about this, because it reminds them that you did cover it. Maybe they weren't listening, but you did cover it. Right?
Sometimes
Yes,
that just doesn't even matter, though, because you're as representing the seller. I've had clients that have said, well, what do I have to lose? I just have earnest money to gain. Let's go to arbitration.
Yeah,
and that's an unfortunate outlook of a client.
Yeah.
But I feel it's my fiduciary responsibility to inform them that our likelihood of success is probably near zero, but I'm there for you. Let's press forward if that's what you really wish to do, but it can get messy and very aggravating for both parties.
Absolutely. And I like what Rich just typed in here. He learned in his old office that most deals go south when somebody's feelings get hurt. Isn't that true? I mean, sometimes we talk about this, and sometimes our job is to try and keep the peace and keep everybody's feelings from muddy in the water. And unfortunately, sometimes that's the real estate agent's feelings. I mean, sometimes, unfortunately, we fight harder on these transactions because maybe we have a buyer's agent that's being the difficult one. I know many times I've had deals where I'm like, I wonder if that buyer's agent even discussed that with the buyer, or if he just threw out his own answer. When you're negotiating with a buyer's agent,
you can typically tell by how quickly the agent answers. If they answer right off the bat, they are not consulting with their client, and I call them on it every time.
Right. Oh, I agree with that 100%. I agree with that 100% because we do have, that for a fact. If I'm talking to a agent on the phone and you're negotiating through stuff and they, instantly, absolutely not. It's like, are you selling this house or are you buying this house? Because I really feel like this. So now, you want to put it in writing and get the other person's signature on that, because that agent is just interjecting their own personal opinion in there and not even discussing it with the client. So, unfortunately, buyers and sellers feelings get hurt, but sometimes it's the agent's feelings that get hurt too. It is what it is, right? Okay. Oh, let's see here. So earnest money, we covered that. I don't want to keep you guys too long. We got about 10 more minutes. Awesome. Let's see here. Listing service, it's understood, that we've got this data and we're going to put it out there into, the cyberspace world and all that good stuff. Seller acknowledges that the information on the seller's residential real estate sales disclosure is accurate. So here's another thing that I want to make sure I stress with you all. We should never help a seller fill out these sales disclosures. And sometimes we have sellers that, especially our elderly sellers, they have to fill this out. If they don't, maybe they don't understand things real well, or they don't remember a lot. But, what you want to avoid is when something happens and it goes to court, what you want to avoid is the seller saying, oh, well, Tim, I'm just going to use you just because you spoke last. And so your name is up on my screen here. So Tim helped me fill this out. He told me to check that box. We don't live in the home, so we really can't help our sellers fill these things out. So you just need to say, this is your opinion, your knowledge of the home. Just go through it and fill it out as best you can. If you truly don't know, check I don't know, whatever. And getting back to what we talked about, what stays and goes, I've had people say, well, they checked on the seller's sales disclosure that the refrigerator is working fine. And so to them, that means it's staying. Again, they're just saying it's working fine. If we negotiate that refrigerator, at the time of that I filled this out, my refrigerator is working. So again, the purchase agreement is still going to trump that, even though, because I've had people try and fall back on the sales disclosure and say, but it's on the disclosure, so we assumed it's included. Well, that's your first mistake, is assuming something without clarifying it. So, but make sure your seller fills it out themselves. Keep hands free from that, and remind them, this is where I talk about this too. Once they fill that out and they give that to you with the listing, show them at the bottom of that Mr. Seller, at closing, we have to sign this again, stating that the home is in the same or better condition than when we get a purchase agreement. So just know, if you're filled this out now, so let's say tomorrow your hot water heater goes out and you don't fix it, then now you have to disclose that the hot water heater doesn't work, or something like that. So, and this is the time I would also tell them, the home inspection is going to happen, when a buyer buys a home. And if the inspector finds something that you weren't aware was wrong with your home, and now the inspector has found it, so now there's an issue with it, you now have to fix it, or now you need to update your disclosure. So now's the time to talk about that. When you're talking about the seller's disclosure and you're giving them that document to fill out, tell them how that plays out through the whole transaction. I think that's really important to say, not only are you going to fill it out now, Mr. Seller, but this is going to come into play once we have a home inspection. And again, at time of closing, you're going to say that nothing's changed. It's all the same, or you have to update it and say what has changed. So hopefully, do you guys do that as well when you're going through the listing and you go through that disclosure, explain how that comes into play after an inspection and right before closing?
Yes.
Great.
What I like to do is, especially with a client that is uncertain, I like to just walk through with them, and I tell them, let's just test it.
Sure.
Take a look. Let's investigate it, and if we find that it doesn't work, I would suggest that maybe you get a contractor or a handyman, and let's get this repaired before we put it on the market. So we're putting our best foot forward, and I can get you the money that you want, and it'll save us that aggravation and argument later on.
Absolutely. I love that. Anybody else? You know, I also feel like, especially when we list the rural properties, so two things I'm going to talk about on the seller's disclosure that sometimes I think, especially with, and I hate to keep saying elderly people, but sometimes I think people just don't realize what they mean. So first of all, there's a section on the seller's disclosure, if I have one in front of me, that talks about, you know, have they received any government notifications or utility notifications? And so where I'm going with this is, a lot of times people get these things in the mail and they don't really know what it means, and they shove it aside and whatever, and then come to find out the buyer moves in and, oh, okay, the city was coming through here and now we have to tap into that, and there's a huge fee. And the seller was made aware of it but didn't disclose it. Now the buyer's stuck with this fee, right? So that's something to talk about on the seller's disclosure. Have they received any of those notifications that they're going to have to tie into city utilities, and how that may affect the buyer? That's huge. That we've had several problems of that come up. And then the other flip side of that is when we have the rural properties with septics. And that's just not one of my favorite subjects, because that just gives me a headache every day. But, you know, Mr. Seller, obviously, you know, you built this home, you probably haven't had any septic issues. Just know, you know, the buyer's going to do a septic inspection, and, you know, so, I mean, it's just a huge thing, because they're all different in different counties. We all know that there are different, you know, I'm not going to name names and I don't want to get into that, but we all know that there are septic inspectors out there that, like to get the business of installing new systems. So they try and, you know, go in and say it needs a whole new system. Always get, if a buyer uses an inspector or a septic inspection company, and, you know, your seller has had no issues with it, and a buyer comes along and says this, the seller has a right to get their own inspector out there and get their opinion. Buyer doesn't have to accept that, and the deal may blow up over it. But at the end of the day, you know, these septics are huge deal breakers anymore. And I think at the time of listing, it might be conducive to the seller of a rural property to say, you know, do you have a septic, you know, is your septic permit on file? How old is this property? Have you done any upgrades to it? When's the last time you've had it pumped? I mean, all those kind of things, because there are just so many deal breakers when it gets to this. I mean, just so many headaches.
Have you retained the same number of bedrooms during the inception of the home? So many times they add a basement bedroom, and that's how the size of the septic system is calculated.
Yep.
I don't do a lot of rural properties, but I've run across that almost every single time.
Yeah, you know what, Tim, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we actually had a huge deal blow up, and what had happened was beautiful home built. They built the home and didn't finish the basement at the time, but had a spot in the basement where they wanted to eventually add a bedroom. So it had a window, so egress was fine. And not that it matters, because a closet doesn't constitute a bedroom, but it did have a closet. It also had the egress window, and they just never finished it. So when they went to list the home, you know, we went through, they basically said, hey, you know, we built it with the plan that we were going to put a bedroom down here. We just never did. So dummy me, I didn't check the septic. I didn't pull the permit or the thing, and I should have. because we went off of that. And so we listed it as a 4-bedroom, but put in the remarks the 4th bedroom was not finished, and it's in the lower level, and you know, whatever, it's studded and closets there, egresses there, it just was never finished. So we get an offer, and the buyer and seller go back and forth, and we get into the inspection, and we had a couple other issues that the buyer and seller butted heads over. And so the buyer said he was walking, and the seller said, well, I'm keeping the earnest money because, you know, we've agreed to do this and this and this and this and this. Well, the buyer actually got out of the deal because he was smart enough to call down and find out that the permit was only pulled for a 3-bedroom, and it was advertised as a 4-bedroom. And he bought it thinking it was a 4-bedroom, and legally it is not, because that 4th bedroom, the septic system was not installed for a 4-bedroom home. So, and it was a very expensive home, and it was like $25,000 in earnest money.
Wow.
Yeah, so something to think about. So I think you're looking for a property, you know, and it's got a septic inspection or a septic system, you know, have the conversation with the seller. When's the last time they've done any work on it? When's the last time they've had it pumped and all those things? Because a buyer is definitely going to look into that. And I agree with Tim. Was the permit pulled for the bedroom space that they're now using or advertising? Because if they, you know, let's say these people had finished that other room in the basement, technically when you walk through the home, even though, you know, this one as an example was not finished, but let's say they went ahead and finished it and we're using it as a 4-bedroom, and then we advertised it as a 4-bedroom, and then oops, nope, the septic permit was only for a 3-bedroom. Sometimes the systems can be updated to accommodate that, sometimes not, and sometimes it's very expensive. So just the septic things are something that always throw a headache into a transaction. So if you're listing it, it's better to hit that up front with the seller and find out the status of that.
I want to plug Brandon Volts with the aeration box. He's saved tens of thousands of dollars with a deal of mine, and it was a much better, well, it was a much more affordable plan than the alternative from another contractor.
Yeah, Tim, thank you for that, because I've also had him save a couple deals for me. He's a great guy, very honest. If it needs a new system, he is going to be honest with you and tell you, but if there's a way to fix the system or upgrade the system or do whatever, he's going to give you that option as well. He's a great guy. He used to work for another large septic company, and because he didn't like the way that was going, he started his own business. So again, his name is Brandon Volts. If you guys, I think he's on our vendor list. He's just a very knowledgeable guy. And I think as realtors, it's hard for us because every county has their own differences, and you know, it's difficult for us to keep up with all these things. In Allen County, you do have to fill out, if you have a seller in Allen County that has a septic system, you have to have that septic form filled out. It's basically just notifying the buyer that there is a septic, you know, system on site and whatever. I think Allen County is still the only county that does that, or that requires that, I mean. So something to think about.
Whitley County just updated their restrictions, and there is a form for Whitley County now as well.
Is it similar? I haven't seen it. Is it similar to the Allen County form?
Yes.
Okay. So it's really just stating that the seller is making aware that there's a system on site.
I don't have it in front of me, but I think so, yes.
Right. Okay. Good to know. And you said that was Whitley County? I'm going to make a note of that. And that's the thing too. I think some of these septic people work in, you know, may do work in one county and not in another county. So that's kind of hard to keep up on. So just something to think about if you're listing a property with septic system, is do a little bit more due diligence and research on that. The same thing if you're working with a buyer on one of those properties. You're going to want to do the due diligence for the buyer. So I think it is, I don't want to keep you guys over here, so we can stop here and pick up next week on the next section there. Or actually, since this is really kind of short, let's just finish page 2. environmental contaminants. It's just where the seller is acknowledging that the listing broker, selling broker, and all licensees are not experts and have no special training, knowledge, or experience with the evaluation or existence of possible lead-based paint. That's why we have the lead-based disclosure. Radon, a buyer can do those tests, mold, all that kind of stuff, kind of holds us harmless. The seller agrees to consult with appropriate experts and accept all risks for environmental contaminants and hold harmless the brokers and our companies and all that good stuff. So this is where, you know, it just kind of is our protection and kind of releases us from that. And so we can pick up there tomorrow. I think the rest of it really, page 2 starts talking about the agency disclosures. Again, this is just where you make sure you want to tell Mr. Seller that you're going to list the home and you're working you have a fiduciary responsibility to that seller and you're working in his best interest, but you want to make sure that the seller understands that you may bring a buyer to the table. And at that point in time, now you're working as a limited agent and you actually are working for both parties. And you know, Mr. Seller, I may be working with a buyer and I know he's pre-approved for more than he's offering on your home, but I can't tell you that. But I can't tell him that I know you'd accept this price over, you know, the lower price. So, or I mean, over the higher price that they're thinking about coming in. So explain to them how that fiduciary responsibility works, what agency relationships mean. That's what, you know, starts there on page 2 and it actually continues over to page 3 and talks about what capacity. You know, I do know there are some agents who don't like to be a limited agent, don't want to be on both sides of the transaction. And that's fine. I mean, that however you want to work, they'll refer, if they have a buyer for their listing, they'll refer it out to somebody because they don't want to be the one writing an offer for it. That's fine. I have people that do that and that's totally fine. Other people just explain how that works and what your role is and what you can and can't talk about. And as long as the seller is okay with that, then, you know, there's really no problem with that. So it's however you're comfortable working with that. Does anybody else, I mean, and you don't have to speak up if you don't want to, but is there anybody here that really doesn't like being a limited agent, being on both sides of the deal? I think that as long as everything's explained up front, is totally doable and easy to work through. Just my opinion, but I know some people don't like to do that.
I agree with you, Vicky. I think as long as you're judicious and fair, the negotiations can run a little smoother when you don't have another agent on the other side, to tell you the truth. But in saying that, I've had a lot of success with a lot of other agents as well. So it doesn't bother me to be the mediator between the buyer and seller.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. But again, I've had agents come to me and say they're totally not comfortable with that. And I respect that as well. You know, refer it out to somebody you want then to write that offer for you. I respect that. However you want to handle that, that's totally up to you. But we have the disclosures in place that allows us to do that. I think there are some states out there that don't allow you to be a limited agent, that you can only represent one party over the other. So, you know, we're lucky we can do that if the need arises. And I agree with you, Tim. Sometimes it works out better. And I like to tell that to seller, you know, when you have one agent working hard trying to keep the whole deal together, you know, we have a legal responsibility. It's not like we can just go in and we're just trying to make the most commission we can and get this deal put together. You know, our license is at stake. So, you know, even though we're operating in a limited capacity, we have to protect all parties' interests. And so, you know, we wouldn't be allowed to function. So I think that sometimes it's almost easier when you handle the whole deal. So I think that's a good stopping point. We made it through a couple pages here. Let everybody get on with their day. And does anybody have any questions on what we talked about so far?
Not about what we talked about so far, but maybe when this call is over, I just want to go over line 189 real quick because I have a listing to write up.
What line did you want?
189.
Okay. Okay, let's just talk about this real quick then. I mean, we'll cover it again next week for those that don't want to stay on or whatever, but So 189 talks about seller does or does not authorize broker to disclose the existence of written offers to the buyer. If seller has authorized disclosure of the existence of offers on the property, broker shall also disclose, if asked, whether offers were obtained by the listing licensee, another licensee in the listing firm, or by a cooperating broker. Note, disclosure of individual and company name is not necessary. Okay, so I guess, well, basically when you're talking to a seller, some sellers have the right to say, I don't want you to do highest and best and notify everybody that I have multiple offers. And here's my reason for that. And one of the reasons might be, if I get a really good offer that I want to take, I feel it's in my best interest to not worry about telling everybody else, because I don't want people to run scared and say, I don't want to get into a bidding war, I'm out. So really the seller has the right to say he wants to disclose multiple offers or not. I would feel it's in the seller's best interest typically to do that, but keep in mind the seller has the right to do that. Now, on a side note on that, this has been a big issue lately because the amount of offers that are happening with houses, and that we have buyers that are just furious when their offer doesn't get accepted, right? I actually talked to Lisa Legal Hotline about this a couple weeks ago, because we had we were representing the seller, and our agent received a ton of offers instantly. The seller said, yes, go ahead and do highest and best, and we'll respond by, I don't remember what it was, but let's say we'll respond by noon tomorrow. And so the agent notifies everybody in writing, highest and best, get all offers back to me before we'll make a decision by noon tomorrow, or at noon tomorrow, we'll look at all offers. Meanwhile, seller got a really, really, really good cash offer. He didn't want to wait on. It's like, I don't want to wait anymore. Why would I risk losing this buyer to wait for this multiple offer situation to play out, right? So now you've told everybody they have until noon tomorrow to respond or to bring us your highest and best. But now Mr. Seller's like, no, I don't want to risk losing this buyer. He's telling me I have to give him an answer within an hour, or he's walking. I want that offer. The seller has the right to take that offer.
Right.
The hotline said, if you may want to, obviously, because then you have the issue where other agents feel like you're doing something ethically wrong. Well, you're not. You're working for the seller. The seller is saying, I don't want to wait. This offer expires at 1. I don't want to run the risk of him running away thinking that he's in a bidding war. It's a cash offer. It's a great price. All my other terms are met. I'm going to move on it. So you have, the seller wants you to take that offer. You need to do that. So even though you've told everybody highest and best by this particular time, now you've shortened that. Now, Lisa Legal Hotline did say, if you can, you might want to reach out to all the other offers and say, the seller has since received an offer, that he's no longer waiting for highest and best. He wants to accept this offer and move on. I mean, you can do whatever, but at the end of the day, what I'm saying is ethically, you really didn't do anything wrong. Legally, there's no problem. You have to do what the seller wants you to do and go ahead and move forward on that other offer. Yes, people may be upset, especially in this market, but at that point in time, we're working for the seller and we need to do what he's saying. So did you have a question on that?
I guess the question is is it does or does not?
Sure. So the seller, in my opinion, when you're talking to the seller about the listing, I would explain those things to him. I would say it's probably in your best interest to say, Mr. Seller, allow me to let everybody know we have multiple offers, because that will probably drive your price up. But Mr. Seller, know that if we get an offer that is exactly what you want, you also have the right to accept that. But, I'm just asking you that maybe you let me save face in the real estate community and let everybody know, hey, I know we said highest and best, but he got a cash offer that's going to expire at noon and he's going to take it. I mean, at the end of the day. So it's really up to the seller, but I feel like it's in their best interest right now, and hopefully everybody agrees with me, to allow you to let everybody know there's multiple offers.
Agreed.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, and I would go so far as to say, as a listing agent, I would definitely call all interested parties saying that, hey, I'm sorry, the time frame's been moved up. We've
Yep.
got a offer on the table, and we've got an hour. So if you guys intend to do something, let's do it now,
Yep.
or we're going to accept that cash offer. Cash is king.
Sure, it does put us in a bad spot, but I guess that's a reminder to you all too, to remember that sometimes we get who was it, Rich, you put on there, sometimes we get feelings hurt. And, sometimes we think, oh, this agent is unethical. He must have had that buyer himself in his pocket. Now he told us we had till noon tomorrow, and all of a sudden they've accepted an offer. That's not fair. I'm crying foul. This is wrong. This is where, we as agents need to realize that we don't know everything about the other side of that transaction, right? We don't know what happened with that. Reach out to the client, the agent, just say, hey, I realize that time frame, got changed. What happened? And that's when you'd say, oh my gosh, we got a cash offer, 6,000 over list price. Closing terms were exact. The seller did not want to risk losing that offer. It is what it is. And at that point in time, you really can't disclose the price, obviously.
Right.
What you would say is, I'm just telling you, I had to do what my seller wanted me to do. I did not write the offer, whatever. Even if you did, it doesn't matter. There was a buyer that came along that gave the seller the terms he needed instantly, and he didn't want to risk losing that buyer, so he wanted to move on it. And he owns the house. He has the right to do that. Right?
Right.
So I think, again, that's a reminder to us all to not get so upset when we feel like we lost a deal and it was unfair, because we really don't know what happened on the other side. And we assume that. I've had people come to me and say, I think something was wrong with this because I wrote an offer and now I see it closed, and it closed for less than my offer was. I'm like, well, do you have a copy of the purchase agreement, the other terms? Do you know what happened on that deal? Because I can tell you right now, there's so many other terms other than price on that contract. Maybe this buyer let the seller, we had a buyer let a seller stay in a home rent-free for 4 months because they were building a home, and the buyer didn't need to move in. They were living with their parents. They didn't care. That helped them get the offer. Mr. Seller, what do you need for possession? Oh, you're building a house? How long do you need? You want 4 months? We'll let you stay 4 months. I just want to make sure I get this house. I'm living with my parents. I don't care when I move in. I just want to get this house. And so, yeah, it was less money, but it really wasn't less money because they stayed rent-free for 4 months. So we don't know the other terms. We always assume, and we usually assume wrong. Like I said, he said it best when he said sometimes feeling gets hurt, and unfortunately sometimes it's the agent's feelings that get hurt. But get over it, move on. There's probably more to the deal than you know. The sale price wasn't the only determining factor of that purchase agreement. That's why the purchase agreement is 8 pages. We don't just negotiate price.
As the buyer's agent in that scenario, I would be more concerned about damage control to the relationship between me and my buyer.
Sure.
And as you said, I would be instructing them to make your deal as appealing as possible. And I would be calling the seller's agent asking, how can I make this deal very comfortable for your sellers? Trying to figure out as much information as you can before you even write the first offer.
Right. Thank you, Tim. We talked about that in the purchase agreement class. If you're writing an offer and you're trying to win over all the other offers flying around out there, take a breath, pick up the phone, call the agent. What does your seller need for closing and possession? What's your seller's situation here? Because we are willing to work with anything we can to get this house. We have, I know somebody who just, won out on a deal because the buyer wrote a letter and explained their circumstance. And, $1,000 here or there at that point in time, the seller was like, you know what? I feel very confident with this. I want this buyer to get my house. Sometimes, it's the little things. So at the end of the day, it's a transaction, but, there's also human beings involved. And there's a seller that maybe has lived and raised their children in this home, and it's important to them to know that they're selling it to somebody that doesn't want to just move in and flip it, that they want to raise a family there as well and create memories there. Sometimes you tug on their heartstrings. So, every situation's different, but that's why Tim said that. Pick up the phone and call the agent before you write the offer and say, what are we dealing with here? I'm going to write a good offer. What can I do to make my offer stand out?
I want to emphasize, if you can hear me, that writing a cover letter for a buyer is amazing. Sometimes they went to the same university, grew up in the same city. It's so surprising what they will have in common.
You are so correct. I appreciate that, because that is true, and especially in this dog eat dog world that we're in, sometimes it does, we are at the end of the day, hopefully, all human beings with hearts, and I think that plays out very well sometimes. And in this case, buyer's like, look, I've lost 4 houses. I'm trying to get a roof over my family's head. What do I need to do to buy this house? I've got kids that need to get a safe roof over their head, or we just moved in. We've been holed up in an apartment it just depends, but write an honest to goodness letter and attach it. And with every good letter, though, I'm going to also throw this out there. Make sure you have a really good pre-approval letter to go along with it, because that's very important. So, all right. I think this is a great stopping point. Shannon, did that answer your question on line 189?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Perfect. Anybody else have any other questions or anything before and then we'll just pick up on page 3 next week.
Thanks, Vicky, for your time. It's always fun.
Thanks for joining me. I appreciate the input. You guys have a great day.
Thank you.
If you need today, but I'm working from home, so if you need anything, text me on my cell phone, and I will get back with you.